Welcome back, everyone. Tonight's story begins with a woman who had spent her whole life learning how to save things that didn't want to be saved. A healer who crossed into Lycan territory alone, carrying nothing but her kit and the kind of quiet competence that makes dangerous men uncomfortable. The territory was Vordenmaar, sealed to outsiders for 6 years, ruled by a king who had stopped naming things after the last one he named walked away. And then a half-dead wolf appeared at the border in the middle of a storm, and she was the only one close enough to help. She came to save a life. She had no idea the life she was saving was the one that would change everything about her own. Let's begin. The storm had been building for 2 days before it finally broke over the Vordenmaar border, and Maren had been awake for most of it. She was not supposed to be this far north. Her route had taken her through the Ashvin passes on a commission from a village healer 3 settlements south. A supply run, nothing more, the kind of errand she took when she needed to move and couldn't justify staying still. She knew how to read weather. She knew how to read terrain. What she had not known, what no one had told her, was that the Vordenmaar border markers had been moved 6 months ago following a territorial renegotiation, and that the stretch of pine forest she'd sheltered under was technically no longer neutral ground. She found out when she nearly tripped over the wolf. He was enormous. That was the first thing. Not the blood, not the stillness, not the 3 arrows embedded in his left flank and shoulder, but the sheer size of him. Gray and silver in the dark. Ink collapsed against the roots of an old pine like something that had decided to stop. She held her lantern out and counted the wounds the way she counted everything when she was deciding what to do next. 3 arrows, 2 lacerations she could see, probably more she couldn't. Shallow breathing, still breathing. She set down her pack. She told herself later that it had been purely professional, that she had not felt anything in particular when she knelt beside him. Not the pull she couldn't name yet, not the strange settling sensation in her chest like something slotting into place, not the way her hands had gone immediately steady in a way they usually only did in the middle of surgery when everything else fell away. She told herself she would have done the same for any animal. She wasn't entirely sure she believed that, but she filed it away and started working. The arrows came out cleanly, which was luck. The lacerations were worse than they'd looked, deep, the kind that spoke of blades rather than claws, which meant this wolf had been in a fight with something that carried weapons, which meant this was not a simple injury. She packed the wounds with what she had, layered her spare oilcloth over the body heat she was trying to preserve, and sat back on her heels in the rain and looked at what she'd done. He was still breathing, slower now, but more even. She rebuilt the fire she'd started earlier, pulling it back from the rain with a flat stone and her body as a windbreak, and she sat beside him through the rest of the night, feeding it small pieces of wood and watching the rise and fall of his side. Counting the seconds between breaths the way she counted everything when she was nervous, which she was, though she would not have called it that. By morning he had not moved, but he was warm. That was something. The second night was harder. The fever came in the afternoon. She'd expected it, had already started preparing the poultice before his temperature climbed, but the scale of it was something she hadn't prepared for. She'd treated wolves before, in settlements where pack members lived alongside human communities, and they ran hot, even healthy. This was different. This was the kind of heat that meant the body was fighting something it wasn't sure it could win. She worked through the night again, changed the dressings, kept the fire, talked to him, which she did not normally do with unconscious patients. But the silence had started to feel like a weight she needed to push back against. "You're going to make this very inconvenient for me," she told him, pressing a fresh poultice against the deepest of the lacerations. "I have somewhere to be. I have a commission. I have a perfectly adequate campsite 3 miles south that is not in disputed territory." She sat back and looked at him. So you should probably survive." He did not respond, which she considered fair. On the third morning, she woke to find herself being watched. She had fallen asleep sitting up, back against the pine, and when she opened her eyes, there was a man where the wolf had been. He was sitting very still in the way that wolves in human form sat when they had stopped pretending to be human. Not tense, not relaxed, just present in a way that took up more space than the body should have been able to account for. He was looking at her with gray eyes that were doing something she couldn't quite categorize. Something that wasn't gratitude and wasn't suspicion and wasn't the careful assessment she'd have expected. Something quieter than all of those. He was also, she noted with the clinical detachment of someone who had seen a great many things in her professional life, not wearing anything because he had shifted back from a wolf, and wolves did not carry clothes. She reached into her pack without breaking eye contact and produced the spare shirt she kept for patients who needed to be covered before she could work on them. She held it out. He looked at it, then at her, then he took it. "You stitched the wounds," he said. His voice was low, the kind of low that came from somewhere structural rather than from effort. "3 times, she said. "The second set came loose when the fever peaked. You moved." "I don't remember moving." "Most people don't during a fever like that." She began packing her kit with the efficiency of someone who had learned to organize under pressure. The arrows were the easy part. The lacerations were blade work. Someone wanted to make sure you didn't get up. A pause. "Yes. That's all you're going to say about it. For now." She looked up from her pack. He was watching her with that same quiet, unclassifiable expression, and she noted, filed away, did not act on, that he was sitting very still in a way that suggested the stillness was a choice rather than a default. The kind of discipline that came from years of learning to contain something larger than the body could comfortably hold. "I'm Marin," she said, because someone had to say something. "I'm a healer. I was passing through." "I know what you are," he said, and something in the way he said it made her pause. But he continued before she could ask what he meant. "My name is Draven. This is my territory." She looked around at the pines, the frost-edged ground, the border markers she now understood she had misread. She looked back at him. "Then I apologize for the trespass," she said. "I'll be on my way." "No," he said. Flat and final, no explanation offered. She held his gaze. "That wasn't a request." "I know." He stood, and the movement was careful in the way of someone managing pain they weren't going to mention. And he was taller than she'd expected, broad through the shoulders in the way that came from actual use rather than performance. And there was a scar along his jaw that was old enough to be silver in the morning light. "You saved my life. You're owed safe passage and hospitality. Pack law requires it." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort. Close enough. "And there's something else. Something I need to think about before I say it." She waited. "Come to the fort," he said. "Please." She filed away the please, the particular weight of it, the way it sat differently than the rest of his sentences, as if it had cost something to produce. And she picked up her pack and followed him out of the trees. The fort at Vordenmaar was built in layers, each century adding weight to the one before it, so that the whole structure had the feeling of something that had been accumulating rather than built, stone on stone on stone, until the walls were thick enough to hold winter out entirely. She followed Draven through the outer gates and stopped when the yard went still. It was not the kind of still that meant nothing was happening. It was the kind of still that meant everything had stopped happening because something had interrupted it. The wolves in the yard. And there were perhaps 30 of them, working, moving, carrying things, had all turned toward her, and then, one by one, in a ripple that moved outward from where she stood, they lowered their heads. Not a bow, exactly. More like a weight pulling them down, like something they couldn't stop. She stood very still and let it happen, because she didn't know what else to do. And she was aware of Draven beside her, not moving, not explaining, the line of his jaw very tight. "What is that?" she said quietly, not a question exactly. "Pack recognition," he said, equally quiet. "They're responding to you." "Why?" He was silent for a moment. "Because of what you are to me, what you might be." He turned and looked at her, and his eyes had gone to that quieter thing again, that thing she couldn't name. "I told you there was something I needed to think about. You haven't thought about it yet. I've thought about almost nothing else since I opened my eyes this morning." He looked back at the yard, where the pack had begun to move again, slowly, the way water resumes flowing after something has passed through it. "Come inside. I'll have a room prepared. We can talk when you've eaten." She followed him inside, and she did not let herself think about the bowing or the weight of his voice when he said, "What you are to me," or the particular way her chest had felt since she'd walked through the gate. She filed it away. She was very good at filing things away. She had been in the fort for 4 days before Draven said anything more about what she was to him. In the meantime, she worked because she didn't know how to exist without working, and because the fort's healer had broken his wrist 2 weeks prior, and the pack's medical needs had been accumulating in his absence. She set up in the small room off the great hall that served as a treatment space, and she worked through the backlog with the focused efficiency of someone who had been doing this long enough to stop needing to think about the mechanics of it. And Draven came to the doorway on the second morning and watched her re-splint the healer's wrist with the kind of attention that suggested he was not watching the splinting. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know," she said, without looking up. "Your healer's wrist was set wrong the first time. If I leave it, he'll lose the fine movement in 2 of those fingers." A pause. "How did you know it was set wrong?" "Because he keeps flexing them, unconsciously. It means the nerve's being pinched." She tied off the splint and looked up. Draven was leaning against the door frame with his arms crossed, and his expression was doing that thing again, the quiet, unclassifiable thing. "You're staring." "I'm aware. Is there something you need?" "No," he said. And then, after a moment, "The pack is asking about you." "What are they asking?" "Whether you're staying." She held his gaze. "What are you telling them?" Something shifted in his face. Not much, just a fraction. "That it hasn't been decided yet." He pushed off the doorframe. "Dinner is at the long table tonight. You're welcome to it." He left before she could respond, which she suspected was deliberate, and she turned back to her patient and did not think about the particular flatness of his voice when he said it hasn't been decided yet, the way it had sounded less like a political statement and more like something he was saying to convince himself. She filed it away. On the 4th day, she found him in the yard at dawn, moving stone. The eastern wall had a section that needed relaying. She'd noticed it on her first morning, on the way the frost was getting in through a gap at the base, and Draven was there alone before the rest of the pack was awake, moving blocks that should have required 2 men. He was working methodically, the way she worked, each movement considered before it was made, and he was not wearing his outer coat, and there was stone dust on his hands and his forearms, and she stood in the yard entrance for a moment longer than was strictly necessary before she went to get breakfast. She did not examine why. That evening he came to the treatment room again, and this time he sat down, which was new. He sat in the patient's chair across from her work table and watched her cataloging her supplies with the particular attention of someone who had decided to do something and was working out how. "Ask me," she said without looking up. "What?" Whatever you've been working up to for 4 days. A long pause. The pack recognition you saw in the yard. It happens when a wolf's mate enters the territory. The pack responds to her presence because the bond registers to all of them, not just to the wolf who carries it. He said it carefully, the way he said everything, as if each word had been picked up and examined before being set down. It's involuntary. It's not something that can be staged or manufactured. She was quiet for a moment. And you think I'm your mate? I know you're my mate. Flat, final, not cruel, just certain in the way of someone who had stopped arguing with a fact. I knew it when you walked through the gate. I think I knew it before that, when I opened my eyes and you were there. He looked at his hands, then back at her. I wanted to tell you before the council did. She set down the jar she was holding. There's a council. There's always a council. Something in his expression that might, in a different light, have been the ghost of something wry. They'll want to meet you. They'll want to formalize the bond or challenge it. Pack law is specific about unregistered mate bonds in the King's line. He paused. I wanted you to know first, so that when they speak to you, you're not walking in without the full picture. She looked at him for a long moment. He held her gaze without flinching, without performing, without doing anything except being exactly as present and exactly as still as he had been since the morning she'd woken up to find him watching her. When is the council meeting? She said. Friday, he said. Man, 3 days. Friday came with frost on the stone and a council chamber that smelled of old wood and authority. Maren had been in rooms like this before, not pack council chambers specifically, but rooms where people with institutional power arranged themselves to remind you that the institution was larger than you were. She knew how to stand in them. She knew how to keep her voice level and her eyes direct and her hands still at her sides, which was what she did when the head counselor, a woman named Vessa with silver-streaked hair and very careful enunciation, looked at her across the long table and said, "You understand that an unregistered bond with the king carries significant political implications for this territory." "I understand that you're concerned about it," Maren said. Vessa's expression didn't change. "The bond must be either formally named within 30 days or formally dissolved. Pack law is clear. An unnamed bond in the king's line creates instability." "I've read the provision," Maren said. She had, in fact, spent the previous evening asking Draven's head of household for the relevant pack law texts and reading them by firelight until she understood exactly what she was walking into. Section 7, Article 3. Both parties must consent to the naming or the dissolution is automatic at 30 days. A brief silence around the table. "You've done your research," said the counselor to Vessa's left, a man whose name she hadn't caught, in the tone of someone recalibrating. "Everyone begins before they finish," Maren said. "That's how reading works." Draven made a sound beside her. It was very small and very controlled, but she caught it and she filed it away, because it was the closest thing to a laugh she had heard from him, and it had happened because of something she'd said, and she did not examine what that meant. Vessa looked at Draven. "The council's position is that the bond should be named. The territory has been without a queen for 6 years. The instability—" "The council's position is noted," Draven said. "Flat and final. The decision belongs to Maren. She was not born into pack law. She did not choose to cross into this territory knowing what it would mean. She gets to choose now, with full information, without pressure from this table." He looked at Vessa with the particular quality of someone who had been king long enough to know exactly how much weight his silence carried. "Are we clear?" It was not a question. Vessa looked at Maren. Maren looked back. "I'll give you my answer before the 30 days, Maren said. "That's what the law allows." It is, Vesa said after a moment. That's what the law allows. They walked back from the council chamber through a corridor that ran along the outer wall, cold enough that their breath showed, and Marin waited until the sound of the council chamber door had faded before she said, 6 years. Draven slowed. What? Vesa said the territory has been without a queen for 6 years. She kept walking, not looking at him. That's a specific number. A long pause, their footsteps on the stone. Yes, he said. Do you want to tell me? Not particularly. And then, after a breath, but I think I should. She stopped and turned to face him. He was standing in the corridor with the torchlight behind him, and his expression had done something new. Not the quiet, unclassifiable thing, not the careful control, but something rawer than either. Something that looked like it had been kept in a room with no windows for a very long time. Her name was Kala, he said. She was my mate. The named bond. We'd had the ceremony. It was registered. It was real. He looked at the wall, then back at her. She left. 3 years in, she went to the Border Council and invoked the dissolution clause, which is her right, which is pack law, which I have never argued with. His voice was very flat. The bond was dissolved. She's in the Eastern Territories now. She has a family. He paused. I'm glad she has a family. Marin was quiet. I stopped naming things after that, he said. It seemed simpler. And then I walked through your gate. And then you walked through my gate. Something in his face that was not quite pain and not quite relief, and was somewhere in the territory between them. I'm not asking you to fix anything. I'm not asking you to be what she wasn't. I'm telling you so that you have the full picture. You said you like the full picture. I do, she said. She looked at him for a long moment. Can I tell you what I'm actually afraid of? He waited. Not the bond, she said. Not the naming, not the ceremony, not the politics of it. I've read the law. I understand the structure. That's not what frightens me. She held his gaze. I'm afraid that you'll spend the rest of your life waiting for me to leave. That every time I'm late coming back from a supply run, or I disagree with something you've decided, or I'm quiet for a day because I need to be quiet, you'll be in that corridor again, waiting for the footsteps that don't come back. She paused. And you'll miss the part where I don't leave, because you're so busy bracing for it. The silence stretched. Draven looked at her with an expression she had no category for. Not the quiet thing, not the raw thing, but something that was both of them at once. Something that looked like a man who had just had a door opened in a room he'd thought was sealed. That's a very specific fear, he said finally. I'm a specific person. Yes, he said, you are. And then quietly, I'm not going to promise you I won't flinch. I've been flinching for 6 years. It's structural. At this point, I know, she said. I'm not asking you not to flinch. I'm asking you to tell me when you do. He looked at her for a long time. I can do that. Then name the bond, she said. On the date the council wants, I'll be there. Something in his face shifted. The stillness of something that had finally stopped bracing. Before the gate, he said quietly. When I said I knew before you walked through, I meant before you crossed the courtyard, when the gate opened. I felt it before I saw you. She held that for a moment, filed it away in a different place than everything else, a place she didn't have a name for yet. I'll see you Friday, she said. She turned and walked back down the corridor, and she did not look back. But she was aware of him standing there, watching her go. And she was aware that her hands were very steady, and her chest felt like something that had been wound tight for a very long time had just quietly begun to release. The naming ceremony was held in the great hall on a Friday morning when the frost was thick on the outer stones, and the torches had been lit since before dawn. The pack assembled in the way of people who understood the weight of what they were witnessing. Not festive, not solemn exactly, but present in the particular way that wolves were present when something true was happening. They stood in a loose arc around the center of the hall, and they were quiet, and the quiet had a texture to it, the kind of quiet that was made of attention rather than absence. Draven stood at the center, and he was wearing the formal colors of Vordenmaar, dark gray and iron, and he looked exactly like himself, not transformed by the occasion, not performing for it, just standing in it the way he stood in everything, as though the room had been built around him. Maren walked in from the side entrance, and she felt the pack's attention shift toward her, not the bowing of the first day, but something more deliberate, more chosen. Heads inclining, fists going to chests in the old gesture of acknowledgement, a ripple of recognition that moved through the room like wind through long grass. She walked to the center and stood across from him. Vesa read the formal words, the ones from Section 7, Article 3, the ones Maren had read by firelight 3 nights ago. The bond's nature, the consent of both parties, the public naming as a witnessed act, binding under pack law, registered to the territory. "Do you name this bond?" Vesa said, looking at Draven. "I name it," Draven said, flat and final and entirely without hesitation. "Do you name this bond?" Vesa said, looking at Maren. Maren looked at Draven. He was looking back at her with those gray eyes that had gone to their quietest thing, the thing she had been cataloging for 12 days without having a name for it. And she understood now what it was. It was the look of someone who had stopped waiting for the worst thing to happen. "I name it," she said. The hall exhaled. Not dramatically, not a gasp or a cheer, just a collective release of held breath. The sound of a room full of people who had been carrying tension they hadn't known they were carrying finally setting it down. Fists went to chests, heads inclined. Vesa made the notation in the formal record with the particular care of someone who understood they were writing something that would outlast them. Draven reached out and took her hand. Not a performance, just a fact. She let him, and her hand was steady. And his was warm, and the frost outside was already beginning to melt in the morning sun coming through the high windows. They stood there for a moment that was too long and too short at the same time, and the pack moved around them, and the hall filled with the ordinary sounds of people resuming the business of the day, and it felt settled, not explosive, not transformed, just settled, the way a fire feels when it's been properly built and doesn't need tending every 5 minutes, the kind of warmth that comes from something that knows how to sustain itself. Later, when the hall had emptied and the formal business was done, and the council had filed out with their records and their careful faces, Maren sat at the long table with a cup of something hot and looked at the fire burning in the great hearth, which was burning well, she noted, better than it had been the first day. Draven sat across from her. "The eastern wall," she said. He looked at her. "What about it?" "The relaying you were doing, the frost gap at the base." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Did you finish it?" "This morning," he said, "before the ceremony." "Good." She looked at the fire. "The healer's wrist is healing correctly now. He'll have full movement in 6 weeks if he doesn't overwork it." "I'll tell him." "He won't listen." "No," Draven agreed. "He won't." Something at the edge of his mouth, not quite a smile, on close enough. "Are you going to count things?" She looked at him. "What?" "You count things when you're nervous. You counted the logs in that fire on your first morning. You counted the council members when we walked in." The almost smile again, quiet and careful and real. "Are you nervous?" She considered this honestly. "No," she said. "I don't think I am." He held her gaze with the gray eyes that had stopped waiting. "Good," he said. Outside, the frost was melting. In the yard, the pack moved through the morning in the ordinary way of people going about their work, and the eastern wall held the cold out. And somewhere in the treatment room, off the great hall, a man with a healing wrist was almost certainly overworking it, and the fire in the great hearth burned steady and warm, and did not need tending. And that's where we leave them. A healer who crossed a border alone and spent 3 nights saving something that didn't know it needed saving. And a king who had spent 6 years afraid to name anything, until she made him say it out loud in front of witnesses. I want to know what you thought of Marin. Drop it in the comments. Did her speech in the corridor land for you, the part about him missing the moment she doesn't leave? Because that one matters to me. And if this story found you at the right time, share it with someone who needs a good love story today. It helps more than you know. I'll see you in the next one.